Can I ask everyone to take their seats so we can get started? Good morning. Thanks all for being here. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of professional practice at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and on behalf of the Center and the Niskanen Center, our partners in this, thanks for joining us today. The mission of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University is to take some of the research being done at one of the world's leading academic institutions, but the audience for our work explicitly is outside of academia, to build partnerships with the private sector, with NGOs, and with policymakers to help inform the decisions that they're making to help enable public and private sector leaders to make more informed choices about some of the most important energy and climate challenges that we face moving forward. And so I think this event is a good example of that, the leadership being shown by Congressman Curbelo to move forward with legislation related to climate change through a carbon tax on Capitol Hill, and we were really pleased to be able to play a role in that by helping to analyze the energy, the economic, and the greenhouse gas implications of that legislation. This is all part of a larger project that we launched back in January, a carbon tax research initiative with the goal of producing clear, objective, data-driven research that helps to enable thoughtful consideration of federal carbon tax legislation in the US. And there's a series of papers we've put out, several just in the last week, but over the course of the last 6 months. It may seem, one may wonder why you invest that much time in something that, at least we'll hear the Congressman's view, seems to maybe not have legs on Capitol Hill today, but these moments can come about, as I know from my time in government, sooner than people think, where there is a national conversation about climate change and about the kind of legislation that we would need to see to take stronger action in regard to climate. And I think if that happens, when that happens, putting a price on carbon in some fashion is going to be, as it was last time, an important part of that conversation, and a carbon tax will be an important part of that. And so we want to make sure that when that moment comes, we're ready and have done a lot of the analysis in advance, along with lots of other great groups that I see in the room, Adele Morris from Brookings, colleagues from Resources for the Future, lots of other places that are similarly working on this issue. Many people view a carbon price or a carbon tax in some fashion as widely viewed by, I think, many as a necessary part of a cost-effective national strategy to address climate change. This proposal is significant, I think, especially because it's the first Republican proposal focused on national carbon pricing legislation in nearly a decade. Congressman Curbelo's proposal would impose a tax on CO2 emissions starting at $24 a ton. It would rise over time, repeal the federal excise tax on gasoline and diesel fuels, use revenue largely for infrastructure to fund the U.S. transportation system, also dividends to low-income families, and a variety of other uses. We'll talk all about that, and you'll hear more about it in a minute. And a summary, the executive summary of our modeling of it is on the table, and the full analysis is on our website. A little bit about the congressman, first elected in 2014. He represents Florida's 26th congressional district in southern Florida, a place that is actually seeing impacts of climate change. He was reelected in 2016, now in his second term, and serves on House Ways and Means. After my conversation, he and I will have a conversation up on stage. Then we'll move to some questions from the audience, and then we'll have a panel conversation after that to discuss the energy, economic, and emissions effects of the Congressman's proposal and carbon pricing legislation more broadly. As I said, we've just finished a series of papers analyzing all of these things in partnership with some other institutions, the Rhodium Group, the Baker Institute, and the Tax Policy Center. Let me just quickly say that this event, like all those hosted by the center, is being webcast live. Both the full video and podcast recording will be available on our website, on iTunes in the coming days. For those watching online, you also have the ability to participate and ask questions through our hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy. With that, please join me in welcoming Congressman Carlos Curbelo.
Thank you very much, Jason, and I want to thank Columbia University and Niskanen for putting this wonderful event together. At this time of deep political division and at least some days political chaos, I am offering this big, sober solution to address some of our country's greatest challenges. For years, Americans have been frustrated with our country's insufficient transportation infrastructure. In Westchester, Kendall, South Dade, the Florida Keys, and all across our land, people waste away a significant portion of each day stuck in traffic and separated from their homes, their families, and their pastimes. Traffic congestion costs our economy billions of dollars each year while diminishing quality of life for the average American. Roads and bridges must be repaired and rebuilt, public transportation networks expanded, and airports modernized to secure a prosperous future for our country. The current administration has called for an ambitious infrastructure investment program, and Congress's response has been lukewarm at best. Another major concern for many Americans, especially among younger generations and those who live in coastal communities, is the reality of rising global temperatures, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather caused by the emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. While there are still some deniers out there, most Americans today understand that climate change caused by human activity is a reality that must be addressed. I remind my conservative colleagues who often decry our nation's growing debt. Saddling young Americans with a crushing environmental debt, meaning an unhealthy planet where life is less viable, is at least as immoral as leaving behind an unsustainable fiscal debt. While I think alarmists contribute little to the advancement of this cause, I do believe the time to act is now. Already, my constituents in South Florida are experiencing the effects of higher sea levels with chronic coastal flooding and saltwater intrusion in the Everglades, which threatens our drinking water supply. Also, ocean acidification is damaging coral reefs and threatening the livelihoods of fishermen and charter boat captains. So all of this is why I'm filing the Market Choice Act, which recognizes the cost of carbon dioxide emissions while at the same time repealing the regressive discriminatory gas tax, which overburns Americans who drive traditional vehicles and fails to fully fund our nation's infrastructure needs. Specifically, this legislation would achieve the following, and I know we'll discuss more in a few minutes. First, the bill would set the United States on a plan to reduce carbon emissions and not only fulfill but exceed the commitments set out under the Paris Agreement. According to the study from Columbia University that we will be discussing today, the $24 per ton price this bill would set on carbon with an annual 2% increase plus the consumer price index would result in 27 to 32% reductions in carbon emissions by 2025 and 30 to 40% reductions by 2030. Second, the bill raises much-needed revenue to modernize our national infrastructure, a bipartisan priority that remains elusive without a new influx of revenue. Under the gasoline tax, the Highway Trust Fund is projected to receive $407 billion over the next 10 years. Our bill would provide an additional $285 billion, along with an additional $18 billion for the Airways Trust Fund. This robust investment in American infrastructure will result in reduced travel times, improved logistical efficiency, and economic growth. Third, the bill would eliminate regressive, inefficient, and discriminatory taxes like the gasoline tax and the aviation fuel tax to capture the entire economy. While the gas tax disproportionately affects those of lower and middle incomes who can't afford higher efficiency vehicles like Teslas, our bill promotes equitable treatment for Americans driving traditional cars and ensures all Americans are contributing their fair share to our country's infrastructure needs. Lastly, the bill creates long-term regulation stability by establishing a moratorium on the EPA from finalizing and enforcing Clean Air Act regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, thus providing much-needed regulatory certainty for utilities and businesses and limiting the economic repercussions of additional regulation. Trade partners will be held accountable by way of a border tax adjustment, a concept advanced in the past by the Speaker of the House and the Chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means. And American exporters will be held harmless to protect their competitiveness. Additionally, there will be more certainty for workers and business as a result of the rolling moratorium on the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. Lower-income Americans will be protected from higher utility bills, and assistance will be provided for displaced workers. In addition to all of this, modeling shows that under this policy, emissions reductions will exceed the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. I truly believe that one day this bill or legislation similar to it will become law. We simply owe it to every American, and especially to younger generations who are understandably concerned about the future. In the short term, it will spark an important debate about investing in our country's infrastructure, the way we tax, and what to do to protect the environment from the perils of human-induced changes in the climate. While those invested in the depressing paradigm of bipolar politics will dismiss it summarily, many others will offer constructive criticisms and helpful ideas. Let us begin that discussion now. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. Just want to start sort of at a high level and then go into some of the details of the bill. Just talk to us at a time, I think it's fair to say, maybe a little bit of an outlier in the Republican Party prioritizing this issue. Before you get to the details of this bill in particular, talk about how you came to prioritize the issue of climate change. This may have something to do with the district you represent. Why is this important to you?
Well, it's a little bit of everything. Obviously, for us in South Florida, this is a local issue, and we are experiencing the real life effects of a changing climate, saltwater intrusion, higher sea levels. We all live pretty close to the sea and just about at sea level. So it really is a local issue for us. But I think this is a time in politics where people in both parties really need to take risks. I think a lot of Americans are rightfully questioning whether this two-party system can meet the country's needs. And as the two parties are pulled further and further apart, I think we need people in both parties reaching toward the middle and really trying to rescue our political system from from fully lacking the trust and confidence of the American people. So that's why I decided to engage on this issue in what I believe to be a meaningful way.
And what brought you to the carbon tax as the best way to address this issue? It's, I think, also maybe fair to say that new taxes are a little bit of a third rail, at least since Bush 41 said, "Read my lips." And there was a previous version of the Scalise resolution sort of condemning a carbon tax. You had supported that. So what's changed?
Well, in a vacuum, any tax is detrimental to economic growth. If we just ask, about any tax that we could levy or increasing a tax without any other consideration, sure, that would lead to lower economic growth and would burden Americans. And that question has traditionally been asked in a vacuum when that resolution has come to the House floor, which is why in previous years Republicans unanimously supported it. But now, because of our work on this legislation and because of the work of many others in the room who have been advancing similar ideas, more and more Republicans understand how carbon pricing could fit in the context of, in this case, infrastructure investment, tax reform, and of course, take into account the economic benefits of fighting climate change and mitigating the future, the forecasts of what climate change could mean to areas like South Florida and many others throughout the country.
And so you say you see change happening more and more. It was only a handful of Republicans who didn't support that resolution this week. So talk more about what indications you see that things are changing, and maybe both public and private, the kind of conversations you see people having and how you see things moving on this issue.
Well, again, change in Congress, Congress lags society in just about every single way. And I think the founders probably intended that to be the case. So it's in part a criticism, but also just a recognition of the type of government that we have in our country. And going from a place where there was unanimous rejection, knee-jerk, reflexive rejection to the idea of carbon pricing, to having 7 Republicans on the House floor refusing to support this resolution is significant, because we had those 7 who went on the record, but there are many others who are reconsidering their position, who asked me many questions in advance of this vote, and who are increasingly going to be willing to take political risks for the cause of good policy. To
Can we get some names?
Protect.
On who those people
Not right now, but certainly we're seeing trends in the House that should give us all hope. The fact that 43 Republicans have joined the Climate Solutions Caucus, recognizing that climate change is real and that Congress has a role in addressing it, this is significant. The critics, the cynics will say, well, they've joined this caucus, but look, they voted against this resolution. And sure, that's important, but the fact that now they can be held accountable and that they can be asked to reconcile their participation in a caucus like the Climate Solutions Caucus with their voting record is important for this cause that I think all of us here believe in. So I'm encouraged by what we see. Obviously, all of us would like to accelerate this process, but we're certainly moving in the right direction, and that's something to be satisfied with.
And you'll introduce it later today? And
yes, later today.
Co-sponsors?
I will not be the only sponsor of the bill. We're still in discussions with a number of offices. This is broad, complex legislation. How many we have today, I'm not sure. I know that there are many who are interested, and in addition to the ones we'll have today, I think you'll see more before the end of this term.
And talk about how you think this bill, coming at this time, can help to contribute, hopefully, to a more constructive dialogue on the climate issue. What do we need to do to have that? And not just on the Republican side of the aisle, your thoughts on what Democrats also need to do to make sure we can have a more constructive dialogue across the aisle?
Well, what we tried to do was find the intersection between good policy and the political energy of the moment. Going back to the 2016 election, I think there was one issue where Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton agreed, and that was infrastructure investment. If you look at polling, it's extremely popular. Most Americans, especially those who live in areas like South Florida, understand that there's a great need in our country and that we're falling way behind when it comes to infrastructure investment. So that's why we're not only filing a carbon pricing bill, but we're also filing an infrastructure tax reform deregulation bill. So we wanted a product where everyone could find a big win for them and for their constituents. And sure, there's some risk-taking involved, but we encourage Republicans and Democrats to look at this model and to consider getting behind it because, again, major priorities for every member of Congress can be found in this legislation. The President of the United States over and over again has called for massive infrastructure investment in the country. I really believe this is the only way this administration will achieve that goal. So that's why we decided to go this route. I respect some of the other models out there, the dividends models. I think there's a lot of value to those, but We thought that at this time, given the consensus around infrastructure investment in our country and just the long-term challenges to the Highway Trust Fund, this was the best solution.
I was going to ask about some of those other models out there, Baker-Schultz, tax and dividend, tax swap. So it sounds like you just elaborate on what you think of those, and it sounds like it's a partly not just policy design, but a political consideration that leads you to the design you've come up with.
That's right. And again, there are a lot of different organizations out there who have done wonderful work looking at different models based on science, on policy, and we borrowed from a lot of that, so we're grateful. But there are political realities, and the bottom line is we wanted to introduce legislation that brought together some of the leading political interests of the moment. So tax reform, we just went through a major exercise in the House. We know that it's an important issue, especially on the Republican side of the aisle. Deregulation, a lot of people have credited some of the deregulatory work done by this administration for the economic growth we're seeing. There is an element of deregulation in this bill, and of course, for environmentalists, the cause of saving the planet, of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and securing a future for all of us.
So I did want to just take a minute and talk about some of the design features of the bill, and then open up to questions. I see a lot of economists I know in the room who would tell us that there are many externalities related to driving. The U.S. has relatively low gasoline taxes relative to lots of other European and other countries. So why repeal the gasoline and diesel excise tax?
Number one, this is a tax that was designed to fund the Highway Trust Fund, and it fails to do that. And clearly, there are not the numbers in Congress today to advance an increase in the gas tax. And even if we did increase the gas tax, we know that it would only be a short-term solution because, thankfully, vehicles are becoming more energy efficient, more fuel efficient, and some vehicles use no gasoline, which again is also good news, but it poses a problem for the funding mechanism of the Highway Trust Fund. And secondly, I do believe that the gasoline tax is unfair and discriminatory. There are a lot of Americans out there who cannot afford the most efficient vehicles. There are a lot of Americans out there who cannot afford electric vehicles, and although we have policies in place to assist them, oftentimes it's not enough. So I think that everyone who uses our roads and bridges should be contributing to our country's infrastructure, including the wealthy businessman who plugs his Tesla into a coal power plant. So this is why we thought that this particular part of the bill would be attractive to those who support tax equity and who believe in everyone paying their fair share.
And so, the details matter. In general, people can support a price on carbon or a carbon tax, and then you get into the details. And so we'll have a couple on the panel of environmental groups and ask this question, I'm sure, of them. But the bill has targets for emission reduction to make sure that the price is actually doing what people hope it would do and what some of the modeling shows it would do. And it also removes EPA's authority over stationary sources, clean power plant, that sort of thing. Talk about the decision to marry those things up, and that's something that comes up a lot. If we got national carbon pricing legislation, what impact that would or should have on the regulatory authorities that agencies currently have?
Well, we wanted to be sincere. One of the major goals of this legislation is obviously to reduce CO2 emissions. And that's why we put this mechanism in place where we do have the rolling moratorium as long as the goals are being met. We also didn't want people to have an excuse to oppose the legislation because they would claim that, well, you're deregulating with no guarantees. The guarantees are there. If the carbon pricing model doesn't achieve its goals, We will keep the regulation in place. Now, we happen to be very confident that we will not only achieve but exceed our goals because all we're doing is accelerating a process that is already underway in our economy, which is this transition to clean energy. We have to accelerate that process because the risks of not achieving our clean energy goals soon enough are dire, are very serious for the planet and especially for communities like mine that are so exposed to the changes in the climate. So that's why we put that mechanism in place. And again, all of this was the result of a lot of input. We met with many environmental groups, we met with corporations, we met with experts, and this is the product of many months of input, of feedback, and of hard work by people in my office. I want to particularly recognize Hector Arguello, who has made this his baby for many, many months, and the many friends and partners in the outside that assisted us.
So lots of outside engagement with your colleagues on the Hill, experts, companies, stakeholders. Have you talked to the White House about it, and what's their reaction been?
We had some conversations with the White House about this model, and they were interested to the extent that it was a means to fund their infrastructure investment proposal. So no firm commitments, no deep conversations, but now once the bill is filed, I certainly intend to take it to the White House and to have a more formal conversation.
And you said that you see movement on the Hill, you see your colleagues sort of, privately, if not publicly, kind of engaging on this issue more. I mean, nonetheless, we did have overwhelming, I think maybe there were 7 who didn't support it, something like that. Support for the resolution condemning a carbon tax this week, and some Democrats also, a handful, supported it as well. So it seems unlikely this bill will pass. I think that's not a criticism. I think everyone probably agrees with that at this moment in time. So the question I wanted to ask you is kind of your view of the theory of change on this issue, right? At this moment in time, doesn't seem likely, but how does that change moving forward? What role does this bill coming at this time have in that? And what role do all the other stakeholder groups you mentioned have in trying to facilitate that?
So we go back to the carbon tax resolution. For many of my colleagues last week, this was still a question in a vacuum because we had not yet filed our legislation. It had just become public that we had the intention of filing this kind of legislation. Once this is filed, once more members have the opportunity to analyze it, to study it, to get feedback from their communities, you're going to see more movement away from that reflexive, knee-jerk reaction to the idea of carbon pricing. And what I would encourage everyone out there to do, not just environmental groups, but every citizen, every American, is encourage both Republicans and Democrats to work together on this issue. If you care about the environment, if you care about climate, any issue you care about on Capitol Hill, it's probably going to require bipartisan support to get done, whether it's immigration, environmental policy, whatever the issue is. If we want to see progress, if we want to see an improvement from the status quo, it's very likely that you're going to require bipartisan support. So hats off to all of the environmental groups that are genuinely and sincerely committed to growing bipartisan support for climate action in Congress. Those groups that are exclusively focused on advancing the interests of one party or the other are making their goals, whether it has to do with environmental policy or anything else, secondary, and that's just a recipe for failure. So I would just encourage everyone to continue engaging. We've seen extraordinary progress since 2015, which is my point of reference. That's when I arrived on the Hill. At that time, there were maybe 2 or 3 Republicans who were willing to openly discuss climate change and to recognize humans' role in climate change and Congress's role in addressing it. So From then to where we are now, we've seen great gains, and we just have to keep doing what we're doing. I have no doubt we'll get to the place where we
Have you also seen a shift
be.
in some of the way the major energy companies are thinking about engaging on this issue?
Certainly. We have met with energy companies, with oil companies, with utilities, and all of the conversations have been constructive, and that's a very good sign.
So we have time for a couple of questions. I know the Congressman has limited time. We have a microphone we'll pass around. If folks could briefly identify yourself and keep your question brief. There's a question from the gentleman up here, and then there was one over here.
Thank you, Representative. I'm Mitch Hescox, the president of the Evangelical Environmental Network. And truly, you are one of the bravest Americans, and I celebrate you for that this morning, so thank you. My question is, you indicated it earlier that removing the gas tax would remove one of the most regressive impacts on the poor. Could you explain some other things that are in this bill that would ensure, how much of America of low income would be protected from any kind of regressivity in this bill?
So thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you for being a constructive voice in all of this. 10% of our revenues under this legislation are specifically designated to help lower income Americans. We know that we will see in some parts of the country, especially higher utility rates. We dedicate significant funding to offset those increases so that those families that are most sensitive to changes in utility rates are protected. In addition to that, we remind everyone that the poor are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. For wealthier people, if cost of living goes up too much in a certain area, say a coastal community like mine, you just pick up and move to another part of the country. Lower income people are not as mobile. So by taking care of the planet, we are first taking care of the most vulnerable amongst us. And I often cite my own faith when talking about this issue because I just think we have a moral obligation to protect God's greatest gift to humanity, which is planet Earth. So that's what we do to protect, and not just lower income Americans, but we also created a fund to protect displaced workers. We know that any time we get drastic changes in our economy, whether as a result of trade or as a result of efforts like these to change the way we tax, that could affect people. Some people could lose their jobs. We have a fund in place to help those individuals get retrained and find other work.
And just to remind people, we modeled those questions like that as part of the analysis of the bill, including the distributional impacts. Nearly all of the bottom 20% end up better off because of the use of revenue, and so you can find that in the analysis, the summaries online that we did with colleagues at Niskanen, the Baker Institute, Tax Policy Center, Rhodium Group. And I did want to acknowledge and thank Noah Kaufman, our senior research scholar at Columbia, who leads our carbon tax research initiative and organized and put together a lot of the research on all these topics. There's a question over here. Yeah. I think the microphone's coming around to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, Harrison Kramer with the National Journal. I was wondering if you think that Republicans might be willing to discuss this a little bit more openly after midterms. I know political pressure might be a little bit more acute now versus later.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think as the closer we are to an election, the less risk members want to take. But we will be having many one-on-one conversations with members. We'll obviously be sharing this with all the members of the Climate Solutions Caucus, giving them the opportunity not just to support the legislation, but to weigh in, to offer their ideas, to share their concerns. This bill is open for amendment. This is not a leave it or take it bill. So, yeah, I do think that in the next few months, members will probably be more reticent to take risk. But once the elections are behind us, we will have a new opportunity.
Question in the front row.
Thanks. James Osborne, Houston Chronicle. Other Republican congressmen who've address this issue have had difficulty, have been voted out of office. I wondered if you've seen any sort of blowback out of this, and if that's a concern for you going forward.
I think any time that you take a bold step or file a meaningful proposal, there are risks associated with that. But if I'm not taking risks, I don't want to be in Congress. I'm not here to pass the time. I think the challenges that we face are too great and too grave to just take a pass and sit in the back row and figure out when I'm going to vote yes and when I'm going to vote no. I have not seen any significant blowback back home. On the contrary, I think most of my constituents are going to appreciate the effort to try to contribute to the conversation, to try to find common ground. The easy thing to do these days in politics is to read from the two old scripts. In this case, the Republican script is no, we're not going to focus on this issue at all. We're not going to introduce any new ideas. That's just unacceptable to me. I think we all, it's incumbent upon all of us, as we see the trust and confidence in our institutions continue to erode, to show the American people that we can advance reasonable solutions that will leave every American better off. If there are risks associated with that, I'm more than willing to assume them.
We have time for maybe one more question, if there are any. If not, okay, one last question over there.
Hi. Mark Trumbull from the Christian Science Monitor, and I'm just curious your view on how a carbon tax would affect the economy. The modeling, I think, shows a small bit of damage to economic growth, but do you think, given the environmental impacts over the long term, do you view this actually as helping economic growth?
Well, look, the bottom line is that if we want to undo the damage that is being done to our planet, there's a cost associated with that. And we have found a solution that offsets some of the costs associated with that, a lot of it with economic gains in the form of modernized infrastructure, a taxation system that is more equitable, that discriminates less against the most vulnerable. So we had to make some tough choices, and that's kind of my approach to all of this. When we undertook tax reform last year, I was always for revenue-neutral tax reform because I was willing to make the trade-offs that were necessary at the time to achieve that. Our Senate colleagues decided to take an easier way out and create $1.5 trillion in deficit spending in order to achieve it. I thought that was unfortunate. With this bill, we're being honest. I mean, we could recommend more debt to alleviate some of the costs associated with this. I won't do that because, again, I think that's as unfair to younger Americans as leaving the environmental issue unaddressed. So, yes, there are some costs associated with it. The modeling and the analysis is sincere and honest about that. But the greatest and the worst cost of all would be an unhealthy planet where rising generations of Americans are deeply stressed and have trouble living in parts of the country like South Florida. So, yes, we have to make an investment, and this bill is sincere about that.
And I'll just remind people again on that question of what the economic impacts are of a carbon tax in general, this broader series of research papers we've done, and the takeaway from that is it really depends what you do with the revenue, and you can see a bar chart in there showing the different uses of the revenue and what the impact of GDP is in an out year relative to no carbon tax policy, and you sort of need a magnifying glass to see the differences in the height of the different bars. And as the Congressman, I think, said, that sort of doesn't account for the costs of climate change if no policy is put in place to avoid those impacts. Thank you all for being here today. I want to thank our partners again at Niskanen, and Congressman Curbelo, thank you for
Jason.
joining us today.
Yes, why aren't you...
Hi, Jessica. Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you.
Okay, let's come back together and spend a few minutes talking about this proposal. I'm Joseph Mikett. I'm the Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center. We're co-hosting the event with Columbia today, and we've been happy to provide input to Mr. Curbelo and his staff as they look at creating what was described in one piece over the weekend as a quirky and innovative approach to carbon pricing. So I think there's a lot of details in this bill that make it look different from the proposals we've seen in the past. We want to spend a few minutes kind of going over what those are, laying out a map. There's a lot of experts and smart folks in the room, and kind of highlight, since we've been privileged to see it before you all, what we think are the interesting aspects of this bill and how we can see it building or not building a fairly broad coalition of support. I'm joined this morning by a lot of really smart people who know a lot in their respective areas. On the far end is Jessica Hogle, who's the Senior Director for Federal Affairs at PG&E Corporation, right? Yeah, it's an investor-owned utility serving Northern California. PG&E has been a leader in the power sector, working with governments to support climate action in that state and nationally, and Jessica has over 10 years of experience in government relations. So we look forward to her perspective and leveraging her expertise in what the business community thinks about these issues. To my immediate left is Noah Kaufman. He's a research scholar at Columbia. He, as Jason indicated earlier, is going to be our expert on the environmental and economic effects of the carbon pricing portion of this bill, and particularly the swap with gas taxes. Nat Cohen is the Senior Vice President at the Environmental Defense Fund. Nat's an expert in carbon market design and international climate policy. And of particular note today, he was deeply involved with the policy discussion the last time Congress took a serious look at climate policy. So we look forward to his expertise. And we also look forward to the expertise of Lynn Scarlett, Chief of External Affairs at the Nature Conservancy. She served as Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Secretary of the Interior from 2005 to 2009. And before that served as Assistant Secretary for Policy. She has a long list of expertise in conservation, and climate issues. So I think it's probably actually best to start at a fairly high level and focus on why this is a fairly exciting day for those of us who think a lot about climate and energy policy. Because, at noon today, we're going to officially end the hiatus of Republican-sponsored climate legislation, which began nearly a decade ago. And for those of us who work in this field, that becomes, creates exciting prospects for growth. So Lynn, as a former administration official, and now a leader on a major conservation organization, how important is it to have a bipartisan dialogue on hard issues like climate? And Mr. Curbelo went over the kind of this risk-taking aspect of this bill, but how much do we need to see that from our leadership?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. You heard the Congressman state the significance of climate change. The challenges are vast and varied, and they are not tomorrow. They are occurring now. Any solution requires, ultimately, all hands on deck. And that includes Republicans. We have to have a bipartisan conversation. And this bill puts on the table a very serious proposal, moving the discussion away from the hypothetical to the specific. Looking at how we can marry up multiple benefits on the infrastructure side, also with the climate side. I will say that the challenges are significant. The bill proposes ambitious results, but we need a portfolio of actions looking forward to the future. And I want to flag one more thing in the context of the bill. At the Conservancy, we're very pleased that in addition to the carbon pricing dimension, the bill would actually invest in what we call natural climate solutions, that is soil health, reforestation, and so forth. Our own research suggests that those solutions can contribute significantly and And this bill puts those ideas on the table. So that conversation, Joseph, is extraordinarily important. It starts a dialogue that has really languished for many, many years and in a bipartisan way.
Well, permit me to follow up on that point, actually, because I wanted to get to it later. But you've worked in an agency, you've done programmatic work, and you're in the best position of all of us to understand what the perspective of a cash-strapped administration official. And lots of carbon pricing schemes that we've seen in the past are kind of, especially from Republicans, revenue neutral. They take carbon revenue and look at cutting off other taxes or providing dividends or these other mechanisms. And this one actually devotes a significant amount to what I would call sort of in public investment, maybe. And it's 70% of that is going to infrastructure, and we can talk later or guess at how that's going to help the bill politically. But almost 10% goes to coastal remediation, soil health, reforestation, and there's also a fair bit of investment there in advanced energy R&D. How important is that to building a coalition in today's political moment?
You know, any policy discussion, I think, as Congressman Curbelo stated, is only constructive if it moves out of a vacuum, that is, and towards specifics. And in this particular case, we have a lot of dimensions to the solution set, so soil health, reforestation, as well as, of course, in the energy sector and reducing carbon emissions. But we also have some additional challenges and problems from the effects of a changing climate. In Congressman Curbelo's district, we are experiencing what is called sunny day flooding. That is flooding that is occurring not when there's a big storm, but because of sea level rise and so forth. These need to be addressed, and we think it's important to look at this as a package, because looking at these provisions as a package provides a way of attracting in the interests across the political spectrum of constituencies that live in those communities affected, across the nation as we consider infrastructure. I had the opportunity to talk with the Trump administration about infrastructure, about their keen interest in addressing it. But the big challenge there is, how do you pay for it? So here's a smart way to marry up a couple of issues, bring them together, and put on the table some solutions for potential serious discussion.
Good. Now let's go to you for a moment, and speaking from the perspective of EDF and somebody who's kind of more familiar with the international aspects of climate. A big part of the sales pitch for this bill is saving the planet. We might take qualms with that exact framing, but the idea that it's kind of winter for climate advocates at the moment, I think is an important context for this bill, right? We expect to see the EPA announce plans to roll back efficiency standards for cars probably this week. We expect a much less ambitious set of regulations for greenhouse gas emissions for power plants to come from this administration than came from the previous one. And most famously, we have announced our intention to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. What would this bill, were it to become law, do in terms of reestablishing American ambition on climate? And what do you, from your vast experience working in the international scene, well, kind of where do you place it in the global march toward climate action?
Sure. Thanks, Joe, and thanks to Niskanen and Columbia for hosting the event, and of course to Representative Curbelo for his leadership. So let me start on the international piece, and I want to bring it back, though, as well as some of the themes that Lynn raised. I think on the international side, this is a vital area where America has the opportunity to take some leadership and to retake some of the leadership we exerted over the last decade or so in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. And what was so important about that was, for the first time, it said everybody, all countries, including countries like China and India, also need to do their share. But that only works if the U.S. is also stepping up and making and meeting our own commitments. So I think it is really important that we restart that process, as this bill does, of putting on the table some actual policies that would meet the commitments the U.S. has made to the international community, that would show our allies we're serious about standing with them on addressing one of the most pressing issues for the international community to address, and that puts us on the path to regaining American leadership. And I certainly think the kinds of steps this bill would take, and certainly the modeling indicates that it would, as the Congressman said, meet or exceed the commitments that the U.S. has laid out in the international community. So I think that's vital for a couple of reasons. I think it's vital for the U.S.'s international standing and for our ability to push others to do more, which helps us in return. I think it's also, I know we'll talk about economic impacts, but that kind of American leadership on climate and on clean energy is vital for our own economy. It's not an accident this bill talks about the 21st century economy, because that's what we're talking about here in terms of regaining American leadership on low carbon innovation and so on. So I think from an international perspective, it's really critical. And I think, to return briefly to what Lynn said, from a domestic perspective, it's almost more important, because it has been almost a decade since we had any kind of bipartisan conversation about climate change. There's been bickering about who's responsible, whether it's actually happening, and perhaps we're nearing the end of that. And I think the really important piece about this bill's introduction is we can now talk about meaningful solutions to the climate change we need to address. We can do that in the context of addressing other pressing challenges like infrastructure, and we can do that in a bipartisan way. And I think that's the really critical milestone that this day represents.
Good. Well, I mean, why don't we jump into environmental and economic impacts? Noah, you and I have both seen this bill. We're familiar with the contents, and thankfully you've been able to take this impressive package of modeling tools that you've built at Columbia, along with your colleagues, and model the bill to try and help us understand kind of its seriousness in terms of emissions reductions, as well as the economic impacts both for lower income groups and for the economy as a whole. So why don't we pause here and take a look at what we might expect and talk and kind of evaluate the bill from that perspective. And I understand you have some slides, so I'll jump up and operate the computer, and you just let me know when you want to switch, okay?
That sounds great. There's probably, if there are lists of things you're not supposed to do in a panel discussion, it probably includes showing slides, but we thought, pictures tend to be more valuable than numbers in a vacuum, so we did want to throw just a few graphics up here to help us give some very high-level results from our modeling. And I should also say, Joseph referenced this, but this is work that has been done with Rhodium Group and also, oh, thank you. You're off the hook. With Rhodium Group, excited. And also with the Baker Institute at Rice University. So they really deserve the bulk of the credit for the numbers that you're going to see. So first of all, let's start with emissions. And a few people have alluded to this already. But what we found is that we modeled a whole bunch of different scenarios. Under current policies, emissions may fall over the next decade or so, but not very much, just gradually, as you can see in the sort of upper band on the screen. If you layer this proposal on top of current policy, you do start to see a pretty dramatic shift in emissions downward. These numbers, I think, have already been mentioned, but by 2025, we see reductions of 27 to 32% below 2005 levels, which is sort of the common benchmark. And then by 2030, 30 to 40% reductions. Now, I guess behind the curtain, the vast majority of these reductions, or at least the over 2/3, are coming from the power sector. There are certain aspects or certain large emission sources that this bill does not do all that much to address. It also doesn't do anything to preclude addressing them separately. Second slide I wanted to show has to do with energy expenditures. Hopefully you can see this in the room at least, but what this shows is that under a carbon tax, energy prices and therefore expenditures will of course rise. This gives you some context. The increase is somewhere between 5 to 10% over the next decade. It is still, if you look at the upper bar, which is the expenditures under the proposal, still far lower than these are per capita energy expenditures, and those levels are still lower than they were in the late 2000s. And then the other important point of context is that these increased expenditures don't happen in a vacuum. They turn into government revenue that can be used in productive ways. With this bill, you see most of that revenue being used for infrastructure. We did economic modeling to see how how it nets out from an economic perspective, not including the effects of the emissions reductions. And what we found was that the effects of spending the revenue almost completely, but not totally, offset the adverse effects of the price increases. So what you see is a very small but negative effect on macroeconomic outcomes like GDP. So then the last slide I wanted to show here has to do with impacts on low-income households. This was also mentioned earlier. The bill takes 10% of the tax revenue, which might be in the ballpark of $10 billion per year, and gives it to states with the direction to provide them as transfers to low-income households. What we were able to do was ask the question, how does the effect of those dividends compare to the adverse effects of the price increases that those same households experience? And what we find, as you can see on this figure, this is a measure of lifetime welfare for households in the bottom 3 income groups, separated by age, which is just how the model is set up. And because these lines are mostly above the sort of x-axis or 0, what that means is that those dividends are in the vast majority of the case more than sufficient to offset the adverse effects of the price changes. So this is likely to be a progressive policy. I guess.
So, can I interject? I'll take my moderator's license here and say, I think this is actually one of the most interesting pictures from your whole report. And I seek to understand it in greater depth over time because the fact that lower income young people and old people seem to do very well is a presentation of public policy that I don't typically see. But when we think about climate, particularly as a policy issue for future generations, the fact that younger low-income people come out ahead under this plan is like a really interesting emergent thing that I look forward to learning more about. Jessica, I don't want to leave you silent over there. And because you come from PG&E, which operates in California, where there is a carbon price, as well as a host of other regulatory interventions, you know, I seek a little ground truth, right? It's kind of one thing to say, all right, here's this fancy computer model, here's what we think is going to happen, small economic impacts, but you know, generally a continued growth path. What is the scene in California, and is what PG&E has seen in California in accord with what NOAA's modeling is telling us?
So, you know, as you said, in California, which is the only state that PG&E operates in, back starting in 2006 under a Republican governor, I will note, the state passed a cap that limited greenhouse gas emissions and set a goal for 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And so that included, as you mentioned, Joseph, a suite of policies that included cap and trade, which was just recently extended to 2030 that PG&E supported. It included renewable portfolio standards and others. And so we have certainly seen in California that you can put a price on carbon and you can grow the economy at the same time. There was a California Energy Commission report that had come out that said between 2001 and 2015 that, you know, per person greenhouse gas emissions had reduced by 19%. The carbon intensity of the state had been below, you know, reduced by over a third. Meanwhile, the GDP of the state increased to 37%. So I think that California is living proof that, you know, you can grow the economy and curb emissions at the same time. And we've also seen success on the emissions curbing side. I don't want to leave that out. So, you know, PG&E, for example, right now 80% of our delivered electricity is greenhouse gas free. We have already actually exceeded the state's renewable portfolio standard goal of 33%. We met it in 2017, and we're well on pace to actually be at 55% by 2030. And then we've also made significant investments in energy efficiency. So despite the fact that we've had population growth, California's energy consumption has actually remained flat since the 1970s. And so in 2016, for example, we had saved our customers $250 million, also avoiding 1.4 million metric tons of carbon emissions as a result. So I think that we are proof positive that you can do both.
Nat, are you signaling a comment?
I wanted to add one thing on the California story. I think Jessica did a great job summarizing it. Here's one stat that I always keep in mind, that since 2006, when California passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, the state has attracted over 40% of the clean tech investment in the entire country. For a while, it had attracted more than all other states combined. And I think that story about how pricing carbon and how leading on climate can attract investment into low carbon technologies, into innovative energy structures, into new technologies and all those things, and all the jobs that come with it, that's an important part of the story if we're thinking about the economics of what a bill like this might do for the US as a whole.
All right, well, let's linger in this California example for a minute. I follow it fairly closely because I moved there when I was 18 to escape the rains of the Pacific Northwest, and I've always carried a real fondness for the state. But also importantly, last year they reauthorized the cap and trade system, and that vote garnered some Republican support, right? Not a lot in the state house, but some, and really critical votes. And one of the things that the Republicans who supported that measure talked about was the difference between carbon pricing and regulation. Because in California, the state has the authority to regulate as it sees fit to meet emissions goals. But you need these monster supermajority votes to have a carbon pricing system for kind of esoteric California constitutional reasons. I think the business perspective, Jessica, to return to you, is really important here because one of the things Mr. Curbelo's bill does is tries to carve out some regulatory certainty for businesses. Now, we've seen this whipsaw regulatory approach to EPA regulations of greenhouse gases. Businesses are still dealing with a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds. So let's take the time to shift to that question of, how important is it to have something like a predictable carbon price set by Congress so we're not at the whim, or our businesses aren't at the whim of kind of cycling between activist and rejectionist administrations?
I think it's incredibly important for a few reasons. One, as everyone has already alluded, we are seeing the risks of climate change. Undoubtedly, they're real. So we had 5 years of historic drought, more frequent and extreme storms and heavy rains, rising sea levels, wildfires. We had the most devastating wildfires last year. And so, they say you got to spend money to make money. And I think, in this case, I would think about, for every dollar you put in a resilience investment, you get, $6 back. So in this regard, yes, having a market-based, multi-sector approach to regulating carbon where there are going to be some costs up front, I don't even know if we can even quantify the benefits that we're going to get in the long run by mitigating these risks that are causing real economic and personal devastation in these communities. And to the business certainty side, absolutely, it's important. We're an infrastructure company. We make long-term investments. We need that certainty to understand the best use of our customers' dollars and where to make the best investments.
Well, let's turn to the environmental perspective on that for a moment. Lynn, I see you. Touching the Clean Air Act is a really dangerous thing in the minds of the environmental community. It's widely seen as one of the best laws we have on the books for protecting public health, for ensuring economic growth in the long term, and it's been used successfully in a lot of contexts. So this bill, just to touch on the details momentarily, installs a 12-year moratorium on finalizing or enforcing greenhouse gas regulations for stationary sources. I'll note it leaves alone EPA authority to regulate the greenhouse gas efficiency of cars. I think that's a result of the tax swap on the gas tax side. But Lynn, what do you think about this idea of performance basing a regulatory moratorium, giving carbon pricing a try and seeing how it works?
Yeah, obviously as an environmental and conservation organization, conservation performance and really addressing the climate challenge is critical. And Therefore, the performance focus is extremely significant. So on the one hand, this bill, or this proposed bill, puts in place a number of features. One, constant evaluation of whether the emission reductions that are anticipated are in fact being achieved, an increase in the price over time, not only pegged to CPI, but also increasing to ensure that performance is occurring. And the regulatory pause, and I will call it a pause, is there to give the bill a chance to work, to give the prices a chance to work while not having duplications and complications and so forth. But it is a pause only. If for any reason the emission reductions anticipated are not achieved or exceeded, then that pause button gets released and regulations can occur. I want to add one other piece to that picture, which is one that you just stated. The authority for EPA to regulate is maintained here. And that is critically important to the environmental community, that we not lose the possibilities and prospects of our regulatory agencies to be able to deploy actions that will address the environmental problems we have. So keeps that in place, but puts a pause, a brief pause, but with a performance set of metrics to ensure that the emission reductions are achieved, and if not, the regulatory provisions can be reintroduced. So very important. I want to add to the California comments. So my home is in California. I was in the mandatory evacuation zone for the fire in Santa Barbara last year. I was in the mandatory evacuation zone for the mudslides last year. Now, of course, we all know that all these challenges are not solely associated with climate change. But I want to repeat the point that Jessica made. The challenges of the effects of a changing climate are here and now. They are not in some hypothetical future. We are seeing them now. We are seeing them across the globe.
We're running short on time, but Nat, I think I'd like to elicit comments from you, because one of the other things the bill does, and Lynn references, it establishes a set of goals based on what it thinks this price will do, right? I think we should be clear that I don't think those are necessarily like long-term decarbonization goals. They probably line up in practice, but the bill says we're going to stand up this price. We expect a certain amount of emissions reductions, and if we don't get them, because nobody really knows how an economy the size of the United States is going to respond to a carbon price of this size or scope, we're going to make adjustments. So could you briefly describe? EDF has done a lot of really innovative work on this idea of sort of nudging a carbon pricing system in the direction of achieving emissions goals. Could you describe this mechanism a little bit and sort of, I think it's fairly novel in the US. Similar systems have gone into effect, I believe, in Switzerland. Just give us a couple minutes on this issue, and then we'll turn to the floor.
Sure, thanks. I do think this is one of the really innovative parts of the bill, and one of the reasons I hope will spark a much more interesting and substantive bipartisan conversation about solutions. The basic idea is the bill says, and I think the Congressman mentioned this, and you just mentioned this, that it has goals put into the bill which are really reflections of what the tax is expected to reach, or what the tax is expected to achieve in terms of emissions reductions. And if all of the economic modeling that NOAA has done and that Resources for the Future has done, if that turns out to be right, and I'm an economist, so I'm pretty familiar with those models, if that economic modeling is right, then the bill stays on track. But if for some reason the economic modeling got it wrong, and we all know that that's a possibility, then there's provisions in the bill that the tax will automatically increase. I think just $2 at a time in this bill. But the point is that if the bill is, if the emissions reductions we get from the price on carbon don't match what we expect, the bill has provisions to keep the emissions reductions on course with what we expect from the beginning. And I think that's important for two reasons. First of all, I think it's just an innovative policy solution that helps bridge the gap for those who are really wonky. We've been having a conversation for too long, a fight between sort of cap and trade tax, cap and trade tax. This just gets out of that whole conversation and says, let's think about how we're going to develop a solution to attack the problem we're trying to address, without falling into sort of the usual categories. The second part, and perhaps more important, is it establishes a principle, which I think is a really important principle for climate legislation that I hope we would see in every climate bill going forward, which is tell us what you think you're going to achieve. And then tell us what kind of provisions will be in the legislation to help achieve that. And I think that's a really important principle to make sure, as the Congressman said, part of the reason we're doing this is to address the challenge of climate change. So that the principle of having measurable, of measuring what you're doing, tracking what you're doing, and then building in provisions to stay on track, I think is a critical part of the bill.
Good. Well, this is
Can I have one thing on top of that?
Yeah, let me introduce the question period, and then
right.
as people are thinking of their questions and finding a microphone, we'll have a comment from Noah. This is complicated legislation. Nobody has had the chance to see it yet. We do want to open the floor for as many questions as we can take, time permitting. We'll do the same thing we did previously. Raise your hand. There's a microphone going around. We'll also, everyone will have a chance to see the bill, I hope, later this afternoon. And then we'll all hopefully write about it for some time to come. Noah, while we're thinking of questions, why don't you close us out?
So I just wanted to recognize, to Nat's point, really this mechanism has to do with the uncertainty in emissions reductions coming out of the bill. And certainly from the modeling perspective, we recognize that uncertainty. And anyone who looks at our report, I urge you to read the boring parts as well that give all the caveats, because these are really important. We can't model everything. But I do want to point out that just because there's uncertainty doesn't mean it's balanced on both sides. And I think there's a lot of reasons to think a carbon tax would be a lot more effective at reducing emissions than our models show. Essentially what we're doing is we're looking around the economy and we're sort of counting up places we think where the private sector might respond. But when you do that sort of bottom-up counting, inevitably you're not going to count everything, right? Just the nature of markets is that the private sector is likely to be more innovative when sort of these incentives hit it than we can count going forward. So I think it's important to have this sort of as an insurance policy, but from my standpoint, I am fairly confident that it would achieve these goals.
I too am long on the innovative prospects of the American economy. Hands up. Mitch, you want to start us off again?
This is basically a follow-up to the question I asked the Congressman. On the 10% that goes to heat reduction costs, energy reduction costs in the nation, how are you going to specifically care for people that have higher carbon pricing within their state versus lower pricing? And in that thing, how similar is this to the traditional LIHEAP program that's in there?
Well, I'll just jump in. I think that this bill designs those transferred to try to achieve its goal of meeting people who get hit, right? So this is a greenhouse gas calculated state-based grant program. So states that have a lot of carbon consumption are going to get more than states that have less. High-emitting large states will get more than low-emitting large states. High-emitting small states will get more than low-emitting small states. And calculating the carbon consumption of a particular state is not an easy thing to do. The agencies are going to have to work out how to do that. But I think it makes a good faith effort in trying to make sure that poor folks around the country get remunerated for not overly punished for like things that are beyond their choices, like what kind of power mix they enjoy.
Hi, I'm Christina DiConsini with the World Resources Institute. This is a question for you, Noah. As you know, the American for Tax Reform Grover Norquist group has sort of pointing to your results on energy expenditure as a way to say that this bill is going to be harmful for the economy and go after it. So I just wanted your response on that.
So I did see that. I think you can divide the effects of a carbon tax into three broad buckets, right? It will increase energy prices, number one. It will reduce emissions, number two. And it will raise a lot of revenue that can be used in productive ways, number three. So the first bucket is negative. The second two buckets tend to be positive. I would just say any group that's out there pushing a policy conclusion based on just the negative or just the positive, I would just be wary of that because that's likely to come from an ideological place as opposed to a substantive place.
I would just say really briefly, any discussion around the economic impacts has to keep in mind, I think the Congressman said this very well, the biggest cost is the cost of doing nothing. And that's the cost we're already seeing. Lynn mentioned it in coastal California. I've seen it in my hometown in New York City. The Congressman sees, and his constituents see it in South Florida. We see it around the country. We see it around the world. We're already seeing those impacts, and we know, if you look at the magnitude of those impacts, those are an order of magnitude easily, 10 more than that times the amount in terms of cost to the U.S. of what we're talking about the investment that this bill makes. So we can't have a conversation around economic impacts without keeping in mind the enormous costs we're already incurring of doing nothing.
And I would maybe just add on top of that California has been very progressive and leading, but California is 1% of global emissions. Mm-hmm. So we can't do this alone. And Governor Brown said climate change is the great unifier. And I think that Congressman Curbelo recognizes that as well and understands that we need to unite people. We need to find common ground, consensus-based solutions and move the dialogue forward. So that's why we're here today.
I'm going to add to the response to that question. So I think Noah's comment very good. There are three different dimensions, and of course the investment in infrastructure has economic benefits. But I want to point out, as I said earlier, that the bill also invests in some other measures, for example, soil health and reforestation and so forth, which are not, if I understand it correctly, not really modeled in terms of what effects that has on the farming sector and so on and so forth. So there are both emission reduction benefits that will come from those investments and also some potentially other beneficial economic outcomes. And I also want to go back, Joseph, in that regard to a question you asked at the very beginning from the vantage point of sort of Republican politicking and the approach to actually taking proceeds and investing them. The Nature Conservancy's done a lot of polling, and there's a strong support in the general public for utilizing carbon tax proceeds to invest in solutions. Mm-hmm. That is, to invest in advanced energy R&D, to invest in, for example, natural climate solutions such as reforestation and so forth. So there's a political benefit. There are also some potential additional emission reduction and economic benefits that come from that approach.
Okay, I'm glad you pointed that out. That's, I think, a really salient point. We've got one here, and then we can probably wrap it up unless there's like a burning issue.
Hi, Adele Morris with the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much to the whole panel. And I want to applaud the work of Representative Curbelo's staff and those who helped them in developing this very solid bill. I wanted to add one dimension to the economic and environmental benefits, and that's the co-control of pollutants that are already under control. I'm talking about sulfur dioxide emissions and particulate matter and mercury and other air pollutants that we know will also decrease along with CO2. So that's another important bucket of benefits. My question is for Nat. I think you're exactly right when you talk about the potential diplomatic strength of a policy like this. And it's not something that's in the bill, but can you talk a little bit more about how you think the United States could engage with other countries with this bill as the backbone of our policy and suggesting how other countries could cooperate with the United States in terms of carbon pricing in their own jurisdictions?
Thanks, Adele. I guess I would, keeping in mind for now, this is, we're all very excited about this. It's the introduction of legislation, so I don't want to get too far out over my skis. I think the most important thing is the potential performance, certainly over the time period of the U.S. commitment, and meeting that. The most important thing the U.S. can do, I think, in the eyes of the international community, is meet the commitments we've made, and then be in a position to press for more from them and to make more ambitious commitments ourselves going forward. And so I think the most important thing, and really the top line headline for me in terms of the international implications of this, would be if this bill or something like it were to become law, the U.S. would be in a position to meet its commitment for 2025. And that's the most important thing. And with that, the U.S. could then be, again, in a position to press others to do more and to step up ambition globally, which is what we're going to need if we're going to address this problem.
Yeah, I'd also add, I'm pretty sure this is if we're to become law, this would be the biggest carbon pricing system on planet Earth by a factor of 2 or more, right? This is like Dodge Hemi kind of stuff. We've got one last one over here.
Matthew Anderson with the National Audubon Society. Joseph, thanks for this and the work that Niskanen and Columbia have done, and thanks to the panelists. I'm struck by a couple of things. One is what a great moment this is. Yes, it is just about, we're on the precipice of legislation being introduced. As you pointed out, it's the end of a long hiatus. And what we've heard from Congressman Curbelo and all of you, I think, is the difficulty of leading from the middle. And so I really want to thank the Congressman and his staff, but then also all of you. It's the worst place to be, and the most important place to lead is right from the middle. My question is, we've talked about this starting in 2020. This is summer of 18. What does success look like for us? I don't want to jump over the introduction and forget this important moment and this high water mark, but between now and 2020 and the end of the next Congress, what's success look like in the from the private sector perspective and from the advocacy perspective and continuing to lead from the middle? What do we need to do, and what's it going to take, and what's it going to look like to get this done?
Who can answer the billion-dollar question?
Well, I'll take a stab. I think, as Nat said, of course, we all recognize this is very much a first step. There's an awful lot of work to be done, but it's a very solid concept, and it does try to package together benefits such that it could be acceptable to a broad array of people. I think next steps include the following. One, of course, PG&E and the corporate sector and their engagement and positive statements from that realm will be extraordinarily important, because hearing the kind of message we've heard today that we can do this, we need to do this. We need to do this for our constituents. We need to do that for our own infrastructure and its long-term viability. And we can do this with economic benefits in the long term. That's going to be very important. Secondly, one of the things that the Nature Conservancy has been doing is to mobilize what we call our 50-state climate strategy. So working through our 50-state chapters and trying to build up bipartisan support in them. I see that as a continuing, very important contribution to this longer-term effort, because if you get states more and more on board and in a bipartisan way, as we increasingly are seeing, that provides a backstop to members of Congress to have the courage to move forward and engage in a constructive way. So I think that's going to be important. So those are two things. There are many, many more things that need to be done, but I'll defer to my colleagues to add to the mix.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Nat.
I would say, just briefly, I think success looks like a more robust bipartisan conversation about real solutions. 10 years ago, it's hard to imagine, we had 2 presidential candidates who both put on the table serious approaches to addressing climate. And since, for the last 8 years or so, we haven't had that at all. Instead, we've had bickering and denial, and the problem's gotten worse. And so I think success is this bill advancing, but other bills advancing, and other voices from both sides of the aisle coming in and offering solutions so that we can have a real debate around solutions and around how to address one of the most pressing challenges we face.
I mean, simply success looks like we have a national program, right? But I think I would just echo what everyone else has said, and that is meaningful, broad stakeholder engagement. And utilities can come on behalf of the communities and the customers that we serve and reflect those perspectives. I think the environmental organizations can keep us honest and make sure that we're driving towards the progress and the reductions that we want to see. And I think anyone else that has an interest should come forward and have a real dialogue and put the ideology aside, I think, and just commit to addressing what is a very challenging problem that requires collaboration.
I'll go even further. I'll say I think success is like actually achieving a system where it's easy to make investments in energy, your carbon emissions are reflected in the prices that you pay, and we create a more efficient, more prosperous economy going forward. And I don't think it's as far away as a lot of people assume. Things can change really quickly. This bill has some really interesting ideas approaching the sticky issues of how you deal with regulation, what you do with carbon revenue, and so continued rapid growth in the coalition supporting carbon pricing is my personal goal. Please thank my panelists. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Big up to Mr. Curbelo for taking a strong stance, and we look forward to a continued conversation. Thank you.